Have you ever wondered how an entire field of study, gets its identity? Well, today, we're diving into the epic intellectual clashes that basically forged the field of international relations and, believe it or not, shaped how we all see our world.
It's a really interesting question, right? For some fields, it's a slow, steady evolution. But for international relations, it was something way more dramatic.
That's right. The entire discipline wasn't built on friendly agreement. It was hammered into shape by conflict, a series of massive arguments that we now call the Great Debates.
And it all kicks off right after the First World War, with this huge battle between two completely different ways of looking at the world. In one corner, you've got idealism and hope, and in the other, cold, hard reality.
So, the war to end all wars is finally over, and this wave of idealism just sweeps the globe. I mean, people like Woodrow Wilson genuinely believed they could design a future without war. The League of Nations was supposed to be the crown jewel of that effort, but then the 1930s rolled around. The League was totally helpless as countries started invading each other. And when the world plunged back into an even bitter war, all that initial hope was just gone. And this slide really nails the core of the fight. On one side, you have the idealists who thought, hey, we can all get along. We can use laws and organizations to stop war. But on the other side, the realists were like, are you kidding me? That's a fantasy. They argued that world politics is and always will be a brutal fight for power and survival. And wow, this quote from E.H. Carr just perfectly captures the realist point of view. He basically called the idealists naive dreamers, like alchemists trying to turn lead into gold. He said they needed to stop fantasizing and start looking at the hard facts. And for him, the most important fact was power, not morality. In the end, history seemed to prove the realists right. I mean, with the League of Nations a total failure and World War II raging, it was kind of a slam dunk. Realism won the debate, hands down. And for decades, this power-first way of thinking completely dominated how we studied the world. All right, let's jump to the next big fight. Because now that realism was king, the question changed. It wasn't about what we should be studying anymore. It was about how we should study it. Is understanding the world an art, based on judgment and wisdom? Or could it be a hard science? I just love this quote because it sums it up so perfectly. Was it a battle of the literates, the people who read history and philosophy, versus the numerates, the people with the spreadsheets and the data? So, this was the big challenge coming from the numerate camp. It's called behavioralism. In the 50s and 60s, there was this massive push to make everything more scientific. The behavioralists argued that if international relations wanted to be taken seriously, it had to stop with all the subjective interpretations and start collecting cold, hard, measurable data. Now, the old guard, the traditionalists, they pushed back hard. They said, look, you can't just crunch numbers to understand human history and complex decisions. You need deep wisdom and judgment. But the behavioralists fired back, saying the old ways were just guesswork. They wanted to find universal laws about how the world works, just like in physics. And, well, in the end, the pull of scientific certainty was too strong. It won, and a new scientific way of doing things took over. Okay, so this new scientific approach then set the stage for the next round of debates. But here's the twist. These weren't about throwing science out the window. Nope. At first, they were about using the same scientific tools to get to totally different answers. And then, eventually, they started to question the whole idea of science itself. So the third debate, this one in the 1980s, was between neorealism and neoliberalism. Now, look at this table. Both sides agreed on the scientific approach. They both believed you could study society objectively, but they used that same approach to get to opposite conclusions. The neorealists said, our models show conflict is inevitable. And the neoliberals said, well, our models show that cooperation is totally possible if you have the right institutions. So really, you could see this less as a revolution and more like a heated family argument. Everybody agreed on the basic rules of the game, the scientific method. They were just arguing about who was winning. And that leads us to the fourth and still raging debate, because this one asks the most radical question of all. What if the so-called objective science everyone was using wasn't objective at all? This is the big one, rationalists versus reflectivists. The reflectivists completely challenge the idea of pure objectivity. They say you can't separate who you are from what you study. They argue that our reality is actually built by our ideas, our language, and our culture.
And as you can see, this isn't just one theory. It's a whole collection of different approaches, all questioning the mainstream. What's so crucial to understand here is that this fourth debate is the most fundamental of all. It's not about which theory is better. It's about whether we can even have a reliable method for knowing anything for sure about the world. And that's a fight that's still going on today. Okay, so after all of that, you might be sitting there thinking, this is just a bunch of abstract academic squabbling, right? Who cares? Well, you should, because this stuff has massive, real-world consequences.
Seriously, these aren't just old arguments in dusty books. They are the actual intellectual toolkit that presidents, prime ministers, and generals use to make life and death decisions.
Just think about it for a second. When a leader argues for war because of national interest, that's pure realism talking. When they push for a climate treaty, that's liberalism. The words journalists choose, the stories they tell, and even the way you make sense of the news on your phone, it's all shaped by the ideas that were hammered out in these debates. Which brings us to one last thought. These debates are always driven by real-world events that break the old ways of thinking. So as we look at the enormous challenges facing us today, pandemics, the rise of AI, climate change, the big question isn't just how we're going to solve them, it's what new great debate will they spark, and how will that new way of thinking define all of our futures?